He thought he could spin the narrative his way until Karoline Leavitt turned the tables with his own words live on air. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and the energy in the studio was sharp enough to cut through steel. A packed audience, millions watching from their screens, and two figures seated across from each other, both waiting for the other to make the first move. Karoline Leavitt sat poised, her expression unreadable, while the well-known liberal reporter David Langford adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He leaned in slightly, his voice carrying the kind of forced confidence that hinted at an agenda. Karoline, let's be honest. The American people deserve the truth. Donald Trump has continuously misled this country. Just last week, he claimed that under his presidency, the economy was stronger than it had ever been. But let's face it, under Biden, unemployment is down and wages are up. Isn't it time we stopped pretending that Trump's policies were anything but disastrous? A flicker of amusement crossed Karoline's face. It was the kind of expression that said, "I was waiting for this." She took a breath, letting the silence stretch for a fraction too long, just enough to make the tension thicken. Then she spoke, her tone measured but firm. "David, I appreciate the attempt, but let's not rewrite history. You're standing here on national television telling the American people that things are better under Biden. Let's talk facts instead of feelings." She turned slightly toward the camera, knowing full well how this moment would play out across social media later. Under Trump, gas prices were at an average of $2.77 per gallon under Biden. Americans are struggling to pay over $4 in many states. Inflation under Trump? Less than 2% under Biden. It skyrocketed to over 9% at its peak. And let's not forget, David quickly cut in, his voice a little sharper now. "That's misleading, Karoline. Inflation is a global issue, and let's not pretend Trump had no hand in setting up the economic downturn we saw when Biden took office." Karoline didn't flinch. She simply reached for her notes and lifted a single sheet of paper. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. December 2020, right before Biden took office. Inflation rate 1.4%. That's not a setup for disaster. That's a stable economy. Now let's look at January 2022 under Biden's leadership, 7.5%. And you want to tell the American people that Trump's policies were the problem? David exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. The signs were subtle, but Karoline caught them. He was recalibrating, trying to find another angle. But before he could speak, she continued. "And let's address unemployment since you brought it up. The Biden administration loves to pat itself on the back for the low unemployment rate, but they conveniently leave out the context. Under Trump, before the pandemic, we hit the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, 3.5%. That was a record. When COVID hit, of course, unemployment spiked. That was a global crisis, not a policy failure. And yet, even then, Trump led the fastest economic recovery in modern history. Biden inherited an economy that was already bouncing back. He didn't fix anything. He just took credit for the rebound that was already happening." David let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Karoline, you're twisting the narrative. And let's not forget, Trump is facing multiple legal battles. Do you really think the American people should trust a man with so much controversy surrounding him?" Karoline tilted her head as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "David, I have a question for you. You keep calling Trump untrustworthy, but how do you explain this?" She reached under the table and pulled out a small remote. With a single click, a video clip began playing on the studio screen behind them. The color drained from David's face, but this was just the beginning. David Langford's face tensed as the clip played behind them. The audio was crisp, unmistakable. It was his own voice taken from an interview just months ago. If we're being objective, Trump's economic policies did lead to historic job growth and increased wages. You may not like his style, but you can't argue with the numbers. The irony hit like a freight train. The very reporter who had just painted Trump's presidency as an economic disaster was now confronted with his own words, undeniable proof that he had once admitted the opposite. Karoline let the silence stretch, giving the moment the weight it deserved. She didn't need to say anything just yet. The audience, both in the studio and at home, was already filling in the blanks. David blinked, his mouth opening slightly before he forced out a chuckle. "Karoline, you're taking that out of context. That was during a different time." She leaned forward. "Different time. David, you made that statement just 8 months ago. If facts change that quickly for you, maybe the audience should start questioning what else you conveniently forget when it suits your narrative. David's hands curled slightly on the desk. He was a veteran in the media game, used to controlling the narrative. But this was different. The power had shifted, and Karoline knew it. The real problem, she continued, her tone unwavering, isn't that you got it wrong before. It's that you get on television today and pretend like you never said it. That's the problem with so much of mainstream media. You rewrite history in real time and expect people not to notice. But they do, David. They notice. David shook his head, forcing a tight smile. Look, if we're going to talk about honesty, let's talk about Trump's behavior. He incited chaos, refused to accept election results, and is facing multiple indictments. Are we supposed to just ignore all of that? Karoline exhaled, tilting her head slightly. Let's be clear on something. Trump questioned the results of the 2020 election. So did Hillary Clinton in 2016. So did Stacey Abrams in Georgia. The difference? When Democrats question election results, it's protecting democracy. When Republicans do it, it's a threat to democracy. The studio audience murmured. David shifted again. And as for the indictments, she continued, we've seen this movie before. Political lawfare is nothing new. But let's pretend for a second that Trump is as guilty as you want people to believe. Are you ready to hold Biden to the same standard? Because I've got a list of alleged corruption scandals involving his family that you conveniently never bring up. David scoffed. Conspiracy theories. Karoline raised a brow. Oh, so now we're doing the anything that makes my side look bad is a conspiracy theory routine. That's cute. But let's be real, David. This isn't about truth. It's about control. The media decides what's worth covering and what's worth burying. You're not informing people, you're managing them. David opened his mouth to respond, but he was out of time because Karoline wasn't done yet. David Langford was drowning, and everyone could see it. The confidence he walked in with had been chipped away, piece by piece, until only frustration remained. He knew the cameras were on him, knew every expression. Every nervous glance, every misplaced breath would be dissected online within minutes. But Karoline wasn't backing off. She leaned in slightly, her voice calm but unshakable. Let's try something simple, David. Yes or no? Did you or did you not say that Trump's economic policies led to historic job growth? David let out a sharp breath. Look, I already explained. Yes or no? Karoline pressed, her eyes locked onto his. David hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. Yes, but thank you. She nodded. Now, if that was true 8 months ago, what exactly changed? Did the facts suddenly rewrite themselves, or did you just decide they were no longer convenient? David's face hardened. He knew he was being backed into a corner, and he hated it. You're oversimplifying things, Karoline. Context matters. Karoline tilted her head slightly, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Oh, I agree. Context does matter. So let's add some more, shall we? She reached down, pulled out a folder, and slid a printed transcript across the table. This is a list of every time you've shifted your stance, depending on who was in office. In 2019, you wrote that rising wages and record low unemployment prove the economy is thriving. That was under Trump. In 2022, under Biden, you said unemployment numbers don't tell the full story. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. You flipped your position, David. Not because the economy changed, but because the person in charge changed. David's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers curled slightly as he glanced at the transcript, then back up at Karoline. He knew he couldn't refute something he had written himself. You don't report the news. She continued her tone. Sharp but steady. You shape it. You tell people what to think. And when facts don't fit the narrative you're selling, you twist them. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. The studio was dead silent. Even the audience, which had been murmuring throughout the debate, seemed to hold its collective breath. David's jaw clenched. He tried to gather himself, but the damage was done. He had been exposed, not just as someone who had misspoken, but as someone who had deliberately manipulated information to fit a narrative. And then came the final blow. Karoline sat back in her chair, exhaling as if this whole exchange had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. You know what's really interesting, David? After all this, you still won't admit you were wrong. Not once. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? It's not about truth. It's about control. It's about making sure people believe what you want them to believe, no matter how many times you have to rewrite the story to make that happen. David Langford had nothing left. No retort, no defense, no pivot that could save him. And the world was watching. But this was just the beginning of the fallout. David Langford sat frozen, his lips pressed together, his usual smooth rhetoric abandoned in the wreckage of the interview. The air in the studio was thick. Not with tension anymore, but with the undeniable weight of exposure. He had nowhere to go. No well-rehearsed pivot, no carefully crafted talking point could erase what had just happened. And Karoline knew it. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. The moderator, who had remained unusually quiet throughout the exchange, finally cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. Well, that was certainly a lively debate. He let out a forced chuckle, but no one else joined in. The damage had already spilled far beyond the studio. In real time, social media exploded at David Langford Exposed was trending within minutes. Clips of the exchange flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The most damning moment, the exact second David realized he had no way out, was replayed thousands of times, turned into slow-motion edits, captioned with brutal commentary. Watch this man's soul leave his body. This is why nobody trusts mainstream media anymore. Karoline Leavitt just handed David Langford his own words and watched him choke on them. Even legacy media outlets, the ones usually protective of their own, struggled to ignore the disaster. Some tried to spin it, claiming Karoline had ambushed David or that the video was being taken out of context. But the full interview was available everywhere. No amount of damage control could bury the truth this time. And then came the worst part for David. His own colleagues, journalists who had once defended him, began to distance themselves. A well-known political analyst from a competing network posted, "This is why trust in the media is at an all-time low. We have to be better than this." Even a former producer from David's own show shared a cryptic tweet. Some people care more about narratives than they do about the truth. It was only a matter of time before it caught up to them. The walls were closing in. David's silence in the aftermath was deafening. No damage control statement, no social media post, no on-air explanation. Because what could he say? He had been caught, exposed by his own words. But Karoline wasn't done yet. David Langford sat stiff in his chair, his usual air of authority shattered. The silence between him and Karoline wasn't just uncomfortable. It was damning. He could feel it. The audience could feel it, and worst of all, the millions watching at home could feel it. Karoline still composed. Let the moment breathe. She knew when to press forward and when to let the weight of the truth settle in. Then she delivered the finishing touch. "David, I'll be fair. Maybe this was just a mistake. Maybe you didn't mean to contradict yourself. Maybe you truly believe you're giving people the truth." She shrugged slightly. But here's the problem. When mistakes always seem to favor one side, when the truth always shifts depending on who's in office, that's not journalism. That's activism. David opened his mouth. Whether to argue or to retreat, it wasn't clear. But Karoline wasn't finished. You claim to care about democracy, but democracy requires an informed public. And what you're doing, what so many in the media do, isn't informing. It's managing perception. You don't give people the full story. You give them just enough to shape their opinions the way you want. She let that sink in before leaning forward, locking eyes with him. So tell me, David, if you had the power to decide what the American people believe, would you ever admit when you're wrong? Or would you just keep rewriting the story until they forgot the truth? The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and impossible to ignore. David's face twitched. He wanted to respond, needed to. But what could he possibly say? His credibility had been ripped apart, piece by piece, in front of the entire nation. And in the world of modern media, perception was everything. The moderator, sensing the interview was well beyond salvaging, scrambled for an exit. "All right, we're going to have to leave it there." But Karoline wasn't letting him off that easy. "One last thing," she interjected smoothly, her tone lighter now. As if this had all been nothing more than a routine fact-check, she turned toward the camera, her voice steady. To everyone watching at home, this is why independent thinking matters. This is why questioning narratives matters. Because when the media picks and chooses which truths to tell, it's not just bias, it's manipulation. She leaned back, finally letting the moment settle. David Langford sat there, silent, exposed, humiliated. And the world was watching. The interview ended, but the impact had just begun. The second the cameras cut, David Langford yanked off his earpiece, avoiding eye contact with Karoline as he muttered something under his breath. The studio crew exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they had just witnessed a career-altering moment. Karoline, on the other hand, remained composed. She stood, smoothed out her blazer, and shook hands with the moderator, gracious in victory, but outside the studio. It was chaos. By the time Karoline stepped outside, her phone was buzzing non-stop. Notifications flooded in news articles, viral tweets, reaction videos. #though Karoline exposes media was the #1 trending topic. One clip had already amassed over 1 million views. Watch David Langford's soul leave his body in real time. Even networks that typically ignored Karoline couldn't stay silent. Some tried to downplay it, calling the exchange heated. Others took David's side, accusing Karoline of bad faith tactics. But the damage was done. The footage was everywhere. More telling, however, was who didn't say anything. David Langford's own network was silent. No segment replaying the interview, no panel discussion defending him. And the most brutal indicator? David didn't tweet for a man who built his career on crafting narratives. That silence spoke louder than words. By the end of the week, whispers began circulating in media circles. Is Langford done? Producers are reconsidering his contract renewal. He might take a temporary leave to let things cool off. No official statement came. No attempts to recover from the humiliation. Because really, how do you recover from something like that? Meanwhile, Karoline, she wasn't just trending. She was booked. More networks reached out for interviews. Podcast invites poured in. Even those who didn't always agree with her couldn't ignore what she had done. And the lesson from it all? People were tired. Tired of media manipulation. Tired of the double standards. Tired of being told what to think, only for the narrative to change when it was convenient. Karoline hadn't just won a debate, she had exposed a system. As Karoline sat in her car, watching the headlines flood in, she smiled. Not because of some personal victory, but because of what it represented. People weren't just listening, they were questioning. And in a world where narratives are controlled, asking the right questions is the most powerful thing you can do. If you believe in truth over spin, in facts over feelings, don't just sit back and watch. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay engaged. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because this is just the beginning.